Hey everybody, Pastor Scott back again for our next lesson as we continue on through the biblical narrative. This time around, we are going to be looking at a lesson known as the split kingdom and really kind of zeroing in on the kingdom of Israel and how after a little while things didn't go so great and it split into two, which is a huge preview of what we're going to talk about today. As we start off, as we normally do, I want to take the time for you to discuss your highs and lows and do the opening prayer together as a family. So go ahead and put me on pause, talk about that stuff, what's been going good, what hasn't been going so great, and share in that opening prayer, which of course I will include in the email. Put me on pause, do it. Yay, good job. An announcement that I want to share. You may have heard about this already. We've put this out into the internet ether already, but in-person education is going to be resuming in the near future. We actually have in-person worship resuming in addition to online, actually starting next week, and education will be resuming as well. We just don't know exactly when yet. There's a lot more moving pieces to education than there is for worship. And so for that to all get lined up and going, it's probably going to be into February, maybe a week or two, or even a little bit longer than that before that picks up. So when we are ready to do that, I will let you know, and we will resume in-person class as well. So stay tuned on that. Okay, with that, now let's move into the time of recapping. When we left off last week, as we talked about King David, that was the main thing, although we talked about his predecessor, King Saul, as well, how they united the 12 tribes of Israel from a tribal group of people into a kingdom. Saul was the first, David was the second. David expanded on what Saul began. David makes the capital Jerusalem, which is a city kind of in the south. And that also becomes the center of worship. Not only is it the capital politically, but it's the capital religiously as well. And in the Jewish culture, those two things are tied very, very closely together. And that really dates to King David and his influence. You may recall, we talked about this last time, that God has given David instructions on the building of a temple, but has also told him, you're not the one who's going to build it. Your son is going to build it. Now, throughout the rest of his life, after we kind of left off, David remains faithful to God, but as we recall from last time, he is not perfect. He had some issues. He was an adulterer. He was also conspiracy to commit murder. So things weren't so great, even though he was faithful to God. And maybe that's kind of a weird tension, but that's in there. Now, he and Bathsheba, who was the wife of Uriah, who was killed, as you might recall, they do go on to have more children. The first baby that they had died, but they had more children, one of which is Solomon, who succeeded David, his father, as king. Now, as we move forward, and Solomon becomes king, Solomon prays to God and asks for wisdom. God actually says, because of the love that your father David had for me, I will give you what you want. What do you want? And Solomon says, I want to be wise. I want to be a wise king. And God grants it. But Solomon's not perfect either. He will go on to build the temple. But then after the building of the temple, which is this large grand scale thing, he spends about twice as long and about twice as much money to build himself a palace that's like 3 times bigger than the temple. So kind of really good, and then kind of like maybe not quite so good. He also builds a bunch of cities, and not only cities, but he also builds forts, fortified cities. We hear that he trades in chariots and war horses, which to us may not sound that cool, but back in those days, those were the tanks. So he becomes really kind of a military force, or the leader of a military force. And all of these things that he is building and developing and creating, he does through the work of something called conscripted labor. Now, what conscripted labor is essentially the king or the leadership says to you, you have to come do this work. You have no choice. You have to come do this work. And folks, what do we call someone who has to do work whether they want to or not? Kind of sounds like a slave, right? Almost like he's using slave labor. Now, here's the weird thing. Remember the warning that God had given to the people when they left Egypt? And this was kind of around all the 10 commandments and everything. Remember how you were treated in Egypt. You were slaves and they took advantage of you. So don't do that. God had given this warning. And now Solomon, wise as he is, has basically become the new Pharaoh And Egypt, or not Egypt, excuse me, Israel kind of becomes the quote unquote superpower of the region of the day under his leadership and under the leadership of David before him. And so they kind of become the new Egypt. They did exactly what God had warned them all those years in advance not to do. And yet that's what we see. Kind of seems like things are both going really well, and maybe things aren't going so well all at the same time. Now, the nation of Israel, the united tribes that became a kingdom. We have King Saul, and he reigned for 40 years. Then we had King David, who reigned for 40 years. And then we had King Solomon, who reigned, you guessed it, 40 years. Are you sensing a trend here? 40 is one of those great numbers. Whenever I ask you an amount of time, oftentimes 40 is going to be the answer. And if not, 400 might be the answer too. Just remember that moving forward. But so 40 years, 40 years, 40 years. We have this successful nation, this thriving and growing and prospering nation under these three kings for about 120 years. Now, if we're looking back in history to when did this happen, it's from about 1040 BCE to about 920 BCE is this period of 120 years of these three kings. So roughly 900 to 1,000 years before Jesus. That's kind of where it is in our timeline. So as we're looking back, that's when these three kings were reigning and when Israel was growing and everything was going spectacular and not so great all at the same time. But yeah, so that's where we're at in history. Now, remember, when the Israelites first came into the Promised Land, clear back with Joshua from several of our lessons ago, they came in, and as we heard, they kind of started to intermingle with some of the neighboring cultures and people, and they started to marry across those cultural lines, and that wasn't really going so great because those mixture of cultures were kind of leading them away from God, and that was causing some problems, and that trend has continued. Now, I want you to read 1 Kings chapter 11, 1 through 4. Now, this is about Solomon, King Solomon. That's right where we're kind of picking up. If you want to know where this is at in the Bible, my Bible's actually behind me. You can see it right here on the table. So we had 1st and 2nd Samuel. That's what we were looking at last week with the rise of Saul and then David. 1st Kings is actually right after Samuel. So we got 1st Samuel, 2nd Samuel, and then 1st Kings. And that's where I want you to go. 1st Kings 11, 1 through 4 about Solomon. Pause and read it. Okay, that's a lot of wives, isn't it? Solomon's got like 1,000 wives. I don't get it. I don't understand it, but that's apparently what happened. What we hear is eventually through all these many cultures represented by his many wives, his devotion is taken away from God and he begins to serve other gods, false gods. And that's not so great. So now go ahead and put me on pause and read verses 9 through 13. Okay. We hear that God turns his favor away from Solomon and he says, your child will lose most of the kingdom. Your son will lose most of the kingdom. And this is a kind of a prophecy that comes at Solomon's expense. Because you have turned away from me, I will turn away from you, and things are going to go badly in the future. That's essentially what this prophecy says. Now, in the time that follows, while Solomon is still alive, quite a few different adversaries for him begin to rise up. People who sort of are a challenge to his authority or a challenge to his power. And they begin to pull some of the loyalty of the people away from Solomon. Now, we heard something like this before. Kind of sounds familiar, almost sort of like King Saul and David, right? And that whole interaction, same type of situation going on here, folks. Now, the most successful of these various adversaries is this common guy, this commoner, whose name is Rehoboam. No, you know what? I said that wrong. Sorry, preview. Jeroboam. We got all these names. Sometimes I get them a little mixed up. Jeroboam. Now, first, he is actually serving the king, and he gains favor with the king, and then he gains a solid reputation, and he's getting more and more popular. And just like, a couple generations before with Solomon and David, now this is making Solomon, Saul and David, Solomon, and Jeroboam. We're seeing the same sort of thing, and so King Solomon's getting a little cranky because this commoner is kind of starting to take some of the devotion away from me, and that's not cool. So we see that sort of thing going on, and then the king gets really, really angry, and Jeroboam runs off to hide in Egypt. Essentially, he leaves the country because he's sort of in trouble. Um, he stays there in Egypt for a while, and in the meantime, King Solomon dies. And now his son takes over as king and basically inherits the throne. And his name, I said this one earlier, is Rehoboam. So we've got commoner Jeroboam, and we've got now King Rehoboam, and those names are way too similar. So from here on out, I'm going to refer to them as Ray and Jerry. Okay, Rehoboam is Ray, Jeroboam is Jerry, Ray and Jerry. We got King Ray, Common Jerry. Are you with me? I hope so. Okay, let's move on. King Ray inherits a kind of a bad rap with some of the people, especially in the northern part of the nation, because of his dad's activity. Remember, his dad had treated the people kind of harshly, and he used them basically as slave labor, and especially those people in the north who were farther away from the capital and from the cultural center. And so, because of that, King Ray is starting off with a little bit of an issue because of dad. And so as he is crowned, as his coronation, essentially, he is faced with a choice. Now, I want you to read 1 Kings chapter 12, verses 1 through 4. Here's a question for you. What choice is King Rehoboam, or Ray, what choice is he given here? Go ahead and record that, talk about it, write it down, and then we'll move on. Okay. As we hear, as the story goes on, Ray does not choose wisely. He's given this choice, like, how will you treat us? And he doesn't choose wisely. At first, he's like, well, maybe I need some advice. So he goes to the advisors of his dad, these older advisors, and they tell him, well, your dad was kind of harsh. Maybe you should treat the people well, treat them favorably, and they will serve you. But then he talks to some of his young friends, some young hotshots, and they're like, why would you do that? Why don't you just show them who's boss, man? You're the king. You can do whatever you want to. You think your dad was tough? You're going to show them. You're going to show them how tough you are. I'm going weird there. Sorry about that. Sometimes I go on tangents. But anyway, he listens to his friends. And instead of treating the people fairly, he essentially says, you think dad was bad? I'm going to be 10 times as worse. So the people all get really mad and they all leave. And at the same time, they also begin to hear that Jerry is back in town. He's come back from Egypt. When he heard that Solomon had died and maybe the issues against him were gone, he came back, so now he's back on the scene. With this, loyalty is divided. Ray loses control ultimately over 10 out of the 12 tribes of Israel, and these are all the ones that live in the north, in the northern part of their kingdom. He still controls the tribe of Judah, which is the largest tribe, and then one of the other really small ones. And honestly, at the moment, I'm blanking on what the other one is, but Judah and then this other small one. They remain loyal to Ray. Everybody else follows Jeroboam. So he's crowned king in the north, and Ray is king of Judah in the south. So now all of a sudden, this one kingdom has become two kingdoms. We've got two kingdoms, one of Judah and one of Israel. It still goes by Israel, although sometimes we also hear it called Samaria. And that's a name that maybe you recognize. We hear about Samaritans later on in the New Testament, and they're from this area, this northern kingdom. So this is all kind of figuring in together. Let's see. As a little bit of time goes on, and the northern kingdom now of Israel kind of begins to establish itself. They establish a new center of worship in a town in the north called Bethel. And Judah keeps worshiping in Jerusalem, as they already had been. And this religious division kind of combines in with the whole cultural division and the whole political division. And it really results in this splitting of the two kingdoms from one into two. Now, side note. Remember, we've talked about this before. In the Hebrew language, names mean something specific, right? I want you to think about the name Bethel, the name of that town. Beth, or Bet in Hebrew, means house, and El literally means God. So Bet-El, Bethel, house God, house of God. You see where that name came from? House of God. Bethel. Hey, cool, right? Cool, 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 cool. I love stuff like that. Maybe you do too. Maybe you're like, Pastor Scott, you're crazy. You're weird. We don't know. I don't know. let's move on. Okay, so take a breath, Scott. The United Kingdom of Israel divides into two right about the year 920 BCE. We mentioned that earlier. Now, the two kingdoms exist side by side. A lot of times they're in conflict with one another. Sometimes they kind of get along okay, but they're always cranky with each other. And it's almost constant that they're tense. Sometimes they're fighting, sometimes they're just mad at each other and they're bickering. And this goes on for about 200 years till about the year 721 BCE. This time period covers the books in the Old Testament known as Second Kings and then First and Second Chronicles. So the next three books of the Bible from where we left off here when we read a little bit ago kind of cover this 200-year period of this back and forth of these two different kingdoms and the listing of kings. Now at that point, 721, the Assyrian Empire, which was the new superpower of the day, way stronger than Israel had ever become, they invade from the north. Or they invade the northern kingdom, I should say, the northern kingdom of Israel, and they conquer them. And they take a lot of the important people and they haul them off into exile off in Assyria somewhere. And they bring in some of their own settlers into the land, some of their own people into the land, and they sort of intermingle with the common folks who are still there. And that all leads to some tension down the road in history. But that all happens in that period right about 721. Now, Assyria does not invade Judah, the southern kingdom of Judah, but Judah becomes kind of what they call a vassal state, which is like essentially like, we'll pay you to not kill us, or we'll pay you to not take us over. Just leave us alone and we'll pay you. That's basically what they do. Now, Judah remains self-governing for about 130 more years after this. In the year 587 BCE, the Assyrian Empire has now fallen to the new superpower known as the Babylonian Empire. And the Babylonians come into Judah, and they basically do the same thing that had happened 130 years earlier. They haul people off into exile. They take control over everything. It's just kind of the same situation with a different empire in a slightly different place. Okay. During that initial, I need to back up just a little bit. During the back and forth period, we hear accounts of the different kings of each of those two kingdoms. And I'm talking about that 200-year period when both Israel or Samaria and then Judah still existed side by side before either one of them were taken over. We hear this back and forth about the kings of each of them. And this takes us through those books that I mentioned a moment ago, Second Kings and then First and Second Chronicles. Now, some of the kings are pretty good, and they actually like turn the people back to God and they follow God. Others do not, and they lead the people astray. Remember, they're in charge and they're the ones who are tasked with leading the people. So if the king follows God, the people are going to follow God. If the king does not follow God, the people are not going to follow God. So some do well, some do not so well. And it's this back and forth crazy cycle. Remember, we talked about this with judges just like last time, that someone will raise up and will guide the people and lead the people. And then as soon as they die and somebody else comes on the scene, it doesn't go so well. And it's this round and round and round cycle. Now, there's a really good example of this type of thing. And it's King Manasseh, who was one of the kings of Judah in the southern kingdom. So remember, Judah, that's the kingdom that is still the descendants of David. So that's kind of where we're at in the south. King Manasseh, we can find his story in Second Chronicles chapter 33, verses 1 through 20. So I want you to put me on pause and go ahead and read his story. Go ahead and do that. Okay. Manasseh is a perfect example of this whole thing, as his reign shows both walking away from God as well as following God. So he had a real big change of heart like halfway through, didn't he? Okay. Last thing I want to talk about. We've got First and Second Kings that we hear about, and it's about, hey, the kings, right? And then we get First and Second Chronicles, which is the chronicles of the kings, which is kind of the same thing, right? It sounds about the same. You know what? It pretty much is. And the reason for that, both of these two sets, so it's 4 books, but it's like First and Second Kings is kind of its own volume, and then First and Second Chronicles is kind of its own volume. So these 4 books of the Bible, they're all about the ongoing line of kings of both nations. And they're very similar. In fact, some parts are actually repeated verbatim in one set and in the other set. And so it sort of raises the question of like, why? Why would they do that? Well, I want you to think back to our very first lesson and the two accounts of creation. And remember, we talked about this, how they come from different perspectives, and the authors seem to be different, and they have a different understanding, and they're kind of looking at things from different directions. And I think that when we look at 1st and 2nd Kings, and then we look at 1st and 2nd Chronicles, even if part of it is repeated, because it probably used the first one as a reference, these different perspectives are important as we see different views, different looks into that period of history. All right, let's wrap this up, shall we? Because I've been talking for a while. I know I haven't actually had you read that much today, and I haven't actually asked you that many questions yet. Well, I got a few questions here at the end. And yes, this is a whole lot of me just kind of talking about this period of history. So we got these two kingdoms. They had started as one, and then they got tense with each other and split. Their loyalties were divided. But both kingdoms thought they were right. And both kingdoms thought that they had God on their side, right? It's like, God's on our side. We don't know what you're thinking. God's on our side. Oh, sorry. My brain just kind of etch-a-sketched for a second there. Keep in mind, though, that these are all people who are connected culturally. They all date back to Abraham. So as they go back a long way through their history, they're all related. They're all one culture. And yet they're now divided, and they all think they're right, and they all think they've got God on their side. Sometimes they get along, but oftentimes they didn't. So here's a question for you to think about. Can you think of an example, a historical example, where something like this happened, maybe even from our nation's history? Can you think of a time when maybe a nation was divided and everybody thought they were right, and yet they weren't getting along? Think about that. All right, final questions, like normal. Of all this information, of all this stuff that we've talked about, what is the strangest thing that we talked about today? And maybe what's the most surprising? And then finally, any closing thoughts or questions or comments that you have. Thanks, everybody. Take care.